Luzon, February 1945. The jungle rain had lasted 5 days straight, pouring over moss-covered hillsides, as if the sky wanted to swallow the earth. Mud rose to the knees, rifles rusted, and telephone wires rotted in water. On the map of the 11th Airborne Division Command, the Sierra Madre region was marked with 3 words: no contact possible. But right in the middle of that blank space, a rectangular clearing had just been hand-leveled, 150 meters long, so narrow that tent stakes had to be pulled out to serve as boundary markers. At the end of that strip, an L-4 Grasshopper was humming softly, its propeller spinning raindrops into a misty haze. The young pilot crouched in the tight cockpit, hands gripping the control stick. In front of him was the forest, a dense green sea, taller than church steeples, swallowing sound and light. Each time the propeller beat the air, it stirred up a smell of gasoline mixed with mud and metallic fumes. He glanced over his shoulder, where there was a medical supply crate, a few ammo pouches, and 2 boxes of rations tied with canvas straps. The entire hope of the company trapped in the valley to the west was packed into that load. No one spoke when he climbed into the cockpit. The commander looked at him for 1 second, then gave a thumbs up in the pounding rain. The L-4 weighed only 550 kilograms, half as much as a Jeep, with a 65 horsepower engine and a maximum speed of 137 kilometers per hour. According to the U.S. Army Air Force's field report, February 1945, it was a model too weak to withstand tropical winds and too slow to escape ground fire. But today, everything stronger than it was already dead. The C-47 couldn't land, helicopters didn't yet exist, and trucks were stuck on the slope, and in this roadless land it was the only thing still alive. The engine roared louder, the sound like the strained breathing of an animal trying to drag itself free from the mud. The rear tire rolled through the soggy ground, mud splashing up onto the wings, the steel frame shaking violently. As the front wheel lifted off, the soldiers lining the strip held their breath. One muttered, "If it doesn't lift, it's gone." But the L-4 skimmed over the weeds, lifted off the ground at around 65 kilometers per hour, and pierced through the thick fog. In a blink, it vanished into the rain like a scrap of paper carried away by the wind. In the air, the pilot looked down and saw the forest opening into a damp maze. The treetops trembled in the wind, reaching up as if to pull the plane back. He flew low enough to see steam rising from burning rifles below. According to the 11th Airborne Combat Log, February 1945, the U.S. forces had lost 80% of their resupply capability because the jungle paths had been erased. He knew that, and he knew that without this flight, his friends in the valley would not survive the night. Wind slammed in from the mountainside, tilting the aircraft. A drop of sweat slid down his neck, icy cold. He didn't look at the control panel, eyes fixed on the forest ahead, a narrow gap between 2 treetops, just wide enough for the wings to slip through. The plane shook violently, and the engine howled like stretched metal. As he pierced through the rain, the stench of fuel surged. He inhaled deeply, held his breath. "Just one pass," he whispered to himself. "Just once." Then turned back. Below, scattered gunfire, then silence. The forest swallowed everything again. The L-4 dropped altitude, circling like a kite about to fall. From above, he saw a white cloth stretched between 2 canopies, a medical signal. He flipped the switch, held the plane at 30 meters, opened the side hatch, and shoved the crate down. The impact sound was drowned in the rain. He didn't look back, just tilted the wings and pulled the plane up again. At that moment, the sky was nearly dark. Rain blanketed the windshield, and he flew by instinct. No radio, no map, only the sound of metal pounding the wind. In the report from the 12th Army Group Field Communication, this area was called a dead zone, where all signals were absorbed by the jungle. But in that dead zone, one sound remained, the engine of the L-4 heading home. On the ground, a few soldiers looked up. Through the curtain of rain, they saw 2 small glowing dots, the tail lights of the Grasshopper. One whispered, "He made it." The words faded into the thunder, but everyone heard them clearly. When the plane's wheels touched down on the wet strip, the wing bent slightly, but the engine kept running. The pilot said nothing, just removed his flight helmet and exhaled deeply. Mud splattered his face, mixing with the rain. A soldier handed him a cup of hot coffee, steam fogging up his goggles. When the spoon tapped the thin layer of cream, he paused for a second. The scent of milk stirred a strange feeling, almost guilty, the sweetness of a world that had never existed here. Out there, the jungle was still black, loud, without roads, without voices. But in the midst of that silence, there was one sound left to remind them they hadn't been abandoned. The soft, trembling, persistent engine noise, the sound of the smallest airplane in the war. And from that moment, the fight in the jungle had hope. In January 1945, the Luzon campaign began amid the thunder of artillery along the Lingayen Gulf coast. On the headquarters map, red and blue arrows crossed each other, painting a vision of a swift advance. But within just 2 weeks, those lines lost all meaning as the units left the plains and entered the eastern mountains. According to the U.S. Army Pacific Operations Report, 1945, more than 80% of mechanized forces were left behind due to mud and broken bridges. Artillery couldn't be pulled across streams, and trucks sank up to their axles. The tropical rain turned roads into rivers, and rivers into swamps. From Washington, staff officers still believed in the old doctrine. War was defined by long-range artillery and heavy aerial bombardment. Victory comes from high above, a training manual declared. Heavy aircraft such as the B-25 and P-47 were given full fuel priority, while light planes like the L-4 Grasshopper were labelled non-combat, meaning not engaged in warfare. In the official roster, they were categorized with observation vehicles and basic flight training. No one imagined that, in a few weeks, it would be that very secondary vehicle that would save the entire campaign. In Luzon, the jungle was not just terrain. It was a living, dense, and unforgiving system. The canopy rose over 40 meters, completely blocking radar signals. Communication posts lost contact as radio waves were absorbed by the foliage. According to the Signal Corps transmission log, February 1945, units on the eastern flank received only 2% of the signal compared to the average. 1 battalion of paratroopers was lost for 3 weeks, with supplies exhausted to the point of boiling leather straps and young coconut shells. A radio operator wrote in his journal, "We could hear the engines, but no one could see the planes." The Japanese understood this before the Americans did. They didn't attack head-on but withdrew into the jungle, choosing the terrain as their ally. According to the Imperial Japanese Defense Memo, 1945, General Yamashita ordered to force the enemy to drag their artillery into the mud. And that's exactly what happened each passing day. American units were worn down more by the climate than by bullets. Malaria spread quickly, and the wounded lay in long lines along jungle trails, bodies drained of water and salt. In the Luzon jungle, war turned into a biological struggle. An officer in the 11th Airborne Division medical log wrote that on average, 35% of casualties in the first month came from disease, not combat. Ground-based supply deliveries dropped to 1/5 of the standard volume. From the Manila rear base, convoys carrying ammunition and rations stopped at the foot of the Antipolo Mountains, unable to go further. A logistics lieutenant noted, "Every wheel turned in mud, and every man sank with it." Overhead, bombers continued to fly with no targets. The jungle canopy was so thick that 500-pound bombs left only a scorched patch of leaves. Pilots called the area Green Hell. Operational maps gradually lost their meaning. No one knew where the enemy was, where allies were, or who was still alive beneath the thick fog. When the machines stopped working, the doctrine collapsed with them. In the report from the Far East Air Force Command, March 1945, one sentence was underlined in red. Air power has lost its tactical role in the tropical battlefield. It was the first time since 1942 that the US military had to face the truth. Technology could not defeat nature, And while officers sought to carve paths with artillery, soldiers at the front lines had only one simple wish: to see the sky again. In those days, in the Sierra Madre region, there were isolated groups of soldiers with no ammunition, no food, no medicine. When they raised white cloths as signals, they didn't know who, if anyone, would see them. Overhead, dark clouds formed long strips covering the mountaintops. The silence was so heavy that one could hear leaves fall. A soldier wrote in his journal, "We don't need a miracle. We need someone brave enough to fly into this." That was the moment marking the boundary between industrial warfare and survival warfare. The theories from West Point no longer held meaning in a land where even light was swallowed by the jungle. Here, war was not measured in tons of bombs, but in each ration box dropped in the right spot. And when all large machines came to a halt, the smallest thing, a 550 kg L-4 aircraft, became the only thing that could still move. In the pouring rain, in that green hell, people began to understand that victory did not always come from strength, but from the ability to survive. A doctrine had died in the jungle, but from its ashes, a new idea was forming: the idea that the sky could shrink down to just a single small propeller. In the days when Luzon was being swallowed by rain, when every unit's calls for help went unanswered, one artillery officer quietly wrote in his notebook, "If the roads can't reach them, I'll open a road in the sky." The short line, slanted and mud-stained, sat beside an engine grease smear. His name was Captain Felix A. Coune, of the 11th Airborne Division. Before going to war, he was a mechanic in Springfield, Illinois, a man who spent hours disassembling Ford Model A engines to understand how a camshaft could set the whole machine in motion. He brought that way of thinking into the military, believing that anything could be fixed, as long as he had a wrench in hand. Coune wasn't a hero in the traditional military mold. He was quiet, always taking notes, preferring to experiment for himself rather than give orders. According to the 11th Airborne After-Action Report, February 1945, he was assigned to the Artillery Observation Unit, responsible for adjusting fire using the L-4 Grasshopper reconnaissance aircraft. But as the Luzon campaign pushed deeper into the jungle, that job became meaningless. Artillery couldn't see its targets, and infantry was dying slowly from lack of supplies. In the long afternoons, as rain cloaked the mountain bases, Coune stood watching the C-47 seconds circle, unable to land. An idea began to form: if the grasshoppers couldn't guide artillery, they could still carry something else. In a corner of a makeshift airstrip near Tagaytay, Coune began experimenting. He removed the passenger seat from an L-4, strapped a rice crate and several ammo bags to the rear frame. When he took off, the aircraft tilted hard to the right, nearly flipping. He landed, removed everything, and started again. The next day, he tried replacing the straps with parachute cable, distributing the load more evenly. On the third attempt, the plane managed to take off, circled briefly, and landed safely. A crew chief nearby shook his head. "You trying to turn that thing into a truck?" Coune laughed. "I'm trying to turn it into a road." His resources were laughably limited. According to the Air Liaison Equipment Record, 1945, at the time, the 11th Airborne had only 9 Liters, 4 Grasshoppers, and 7 Liters, 5 Sentinels, most with over 400 flight hours, patched with aluminum sheets from old fuel drums. No weapons, no strong radios, no radar, and just enough fuel for 2 hours of flight. But he knew every number and believed engineering could make up for all limitations. With his mechanical background, he adjusted the fuel ratio in the Stromberg NAS-3A carburetor, allowing the Continental A65 engine to run more stably in 98% humidity. In the following days, Coune trained his artillery pilots on how to load cargo and fly low through the jungle. He made them practice circling just above treetop level, simulating airflow disrupted by canopy drag, one lieutenant recalled. "He made us fly low enough to see the leaves brushing the wings. People thought he was crazy, but he said, 'If you fly high, you'll miss the person waiting below.'" Coune didn't ask for permission. He knew that if he did, the plan would be shut down immediately. Orders from above were still clear. Number 4 seconds are not to be used for transport missions. According to Headquarters Memorandum Number 12, February 1945, this aircraft type was only authorized for communication and artillery adjustment, but in the middle of the battlefield, Coune believed the only order worth following was to save lives. He told his pilots, "We weren't built to survive here, but we're going to rebuild ourselves." From February 10 to 12, he and a team of technicians worked non-stop in the rain. They cut and shaped lightweight steel bars, welded reinforcement frames, and rigged parachute straps through cabin doors. The hammering, the rain, and the engine noise blended into the heartbeat of the battlefield. One night, after completing the first modified L-4, he wrote in his journal, "We're about to create something not found in any manual, a survival machine." The next morning, just as the sun crested the mountain, Coune stepped up to the Grasshopper, now deformed from all the trial runs. The fuselage was coated in grey mud, and the tail frame was held together with fresh welds. He ran his hand over the cold, wet metal, looking out over the water-streaked runway. A young pilot approached and quietly asked, "Sir, who's going to fly first?" Coune answered, voice low and firm, "I built it. I'll test it." The words weren't loud, but everyone nearby fell silent. In the rain, they watched him climb into the cockpit, secure the latch, and push the throttle. The engine sputtered to life, a lonely sound in the damp air. As the plane rolled forward, someone muttered, "He's trying to fly on faith." And in the cold wind, the Grasshopper lifted off the ground, charging into the mist as if the whole sky had just opened up for an idea. According to the Pacific Air Operations Summary, February 1945, this was the first resupply flight ever conducted by L-4 aircraft on Luzon. From that moment on, Coune was no longer just an artillery officer. He was the battlefield's first engineer, the man who dared to turn despair into a blueprint for survival. When Captain Felix A. Coune's idea left the page and entered the field workshop, everything became both highly mechanical and incredibly simple at the same time. They began with the most obvious step, removing the passenger seat to open up the cargo space, but the more critical move was reinforcing the structure, since the L-4's cabin frame had only been designed for one observer. The engineering team welded thin steel bars to distribute load evenly across the aircraft's frame, then rechecked the tie-down points, with the goal of raising the safe payload to 200 kilograms per flight, a number that was repeatedly tested on the airstrip before live operations. According to the 11th Airborne After-Action Report, February 1945, these modifications allowed the Grasshopper to transition from a reconnaissance plane into a small airborne cargo unit capable of operating safely under tropical rainforest conditions. The cargo drop mechanism was the decisive innovation. They didn't use heavy standard parachutes. Instead, they shortened the parachute cords and crafted a simple latch that could release under force without destabilizing the aircraft. The key was how the load was positioned relative to the lift axis, so the center of gravity shifted only slightly as the crate exited the compartment, avoiding spin that could cause loss of control. Crates were tied with basic rope and had a quick-release latch that would snap open under forward pressure, ensuring the crate fell while the tether didn't pull the tail section. Ground testing showed that 200 kilograms loads remained within the new structural tolerance. The engine stayed within safe limits, and flight control remained stable. The in-air drop mechanism posed a simple yet dangerous aerodynamic problem. They learned to fly extremely low at an altitude of about 30 meters, with airspeeds in the safe range of 65–85 kilometers per hour, depending on the load. Upon approach, pilots angled their wings and used jungle wind currents to fine-tune the drop trajectory, rather than relying on large parachutes. Test results enabled a targeting margin of error of plus or minus 30 meters, sufficient for hitting a clearing or securing a safe drop zone within the canopy. According to Pacific Air Operations Summary, February 1945, this method achieved the required accuracy to deliver supplies to locations without landing strips, where a correctly dropped crate could sustain an entire battalion for 48 hours. The operational organization was designed to be minimalist yet effective. Coune divided the pilots into small teams, and trained them quickly on loading, packaging, hook release, safety checks, and quick turnaround for takeoff. For well-practiced teams, the turnaround time was reduced to 10 minutes per sortie, with every ground operation standardized. With a network of field strips, pilots could perform up to 120 sorties per day, a figure that allowed for significant supply throughput within a 24-hour cycle. These numbers weren't just statistics, they were lifeblood. 120 sorties per day meant hundreds of crates of food, medicine, and ammunition reaching hidden zones in the jungle. Engineering also included adjustments to the engine and fuel mixture. The technical crew altered the fuel-air ratio in the carburetor to improve startup reliability and maintain RPM under near-storm humidity. They optimized the fuel filter system to prevent blockages when using substandard fuel sources. These modifications, based on Coune's mechanical experience, extended engine lifespan and increased flight reliability, a critical factor when pilots had to fly multiple missions per rainy day. Technical success was also reinforced by coordination procedures with ground forces. Before each drop, a group of ground observers would plant flags, spread white cloths, or light small fires to mark recognition points, while also recording wind conditions, tree spacing, and safe zones. The ground team relayed this to the distribution center, which compiled crate lists in priority order. Each crate was tagged with a code, so pilots knew where to drop it and how urgent it was. This approach turned a chain of disjointed actions into a system, with each link measured in minutes and kilograms. Efficiency was not just about sortie counts, but about the ability to turn a small act into a major battlefield change. One crate of medicine, one box of rations, one box of ammunition dropped in the right spot could keep a unit alive for 48 more hours, enough time to reopen supply lines or organize a safe retreat. Those numbers, bolded in reports, became the rationale behind the proof. Small drops, big saves. In the aircraft cabin, as wind rushed through, pilots could feel the weight of each crate, and in that instant, every technical calculation became a matter of counting miracles, counted in kilograms and minutes. In the end, the breakthrough was not just a mechanical change, it was a change in thinking. From observation plane to supply line, from textbook theory to muddy field application, Coune's team turned impossible into a combat standard. They didn't ask for permission, they designed, tested, and flew. And it was these flights, low, slow, precise, that kept the jungle war alive. The 12th of February 1945, clouds hung thick over the slopes of the Sierra Madre. The jungle rain made the sky dense and grey, each drop falling like gravel onto the treetops. In the valley below, an American company had been surrounded for 48 hours, out of food, out of medicine, and with artillery too far away to adjust fire. In the battlefield log, the communications officer scribbled, "All supply routes erased, wind from the southwest, no visibility, and no one has been able to fly in." The final line, written with a shaky hand, read, "If we are not resupplied today, the entire unit will have to abandon the position." That noon, Captain Felix A. Coune walked toward the L-5 Sentinel. Wind struck his face, mist covered the windshield, and the wings trembled slightly. He said nothing, only bent down to inspect the cargo hook, ran his hand over the parachute cables, then looked up at the sky. According to the 11th Airborne After-Action Report, the 12th of February 1945, this was the first flight testing the new airdrop system under enemy fire conditions. Total load, 200 kilograms per sortie, 5 consecutive sorties, objective, to resupply an isolated battalion near the village of Gabaldon. As the Continental A-65 engine roared, its noise merged with the rain into a heavy rhythm. Coune pushed the throttle. The L-5 lifted off the ground, shaking slightly as it hit a patch of turbulent wind. The sky ahead was a block of thick fog, grey haze, and the scattered crack of Japanese anti-aircraft fire. According to the Far East Air Force Field Note 1945, the area contained at least 3 20mm cannons positioned along the mountainside, firing in a crisscross pattern toward the valley gap. At an altitude of 30 meters, a small error could send the plane into the treetops, and the shifting weight from cargo in the back turned every jolt into a real threat. "Hold it steady," Coune said quietly to the co-pilot, his voice firm through the wind. Sweat ran down his neck. Ice cold. Beneath the canopy, American soldiers heard the engine noise. They pulled out a white cloth, signaling with an old mirror. When the flash of light reflected, Coune recognized the signal. He reduced speed, tilted the wings, held an altitude of 32 meters, then gave the signal. The first crate was pushed out. A short, heavy sound. Then silence. A second later, the soldiers below cheered. The crate had landed in the clearing between two canopies, split open, revealing ammo pouches and medical kits. One by one, the crates dropped in succession, each landing with a heavy thud amid the rain. According to reports, within 2 hours, Coune's team completed 30 consecutive airdrop runs, totaling 6 tons of supplies, mostly ammunition, morphine, and sea rations. No pilots were injured, and not a single L-5 was hit. According to the U.S. Army Air Force's field summary, February 1945, this was the first successful resupply mission on Luzon, with 0 losses. As the last L-5 returned, the soldiers on the ground were still looking up, watching the glowing dots fade in the rain. A sergeant recalled after the war, "We couldn't believe it. Everything landed in the right place. Not a single box caught in the trees. We thought they were angels with propellers." That feeling spread across the front. From disbelief to awe, from despair to belief, people began calling that sky by a new name, the only road left. Back at the Tagaytay base, Coune recorded the results in the report. All deliveries successful, accuracy within plus or minus 30 meters, average load 200 kilograms per sortie. His tone was calm, without pride. But those who witnessed it understood that what had just happened had changed the very idea of jungle logistics. On the tactical map, the red line connecting the rear base to the front line now had a new symbol added: Air Drop Corridor L5. That afternoon, when he returned, the aircraft still had streaks of mud on its wings. A young technician ran up and asked, "Weren't you afraid flying through 20mm fire?" Coune answered quietly, "Of course, but they were more afraid down there." Then he walked toward the fuel depot, looking at the aircraft already lined up for the next run. In the 11th Airborne Division Historical Summary, March 1945, the event was noted with a short phrase, "Miracle Logistics Operation, Successful, Morale Restored." No one knew who came up with the name, but it stuck with the unit. A field newspaper wrote that the L-5 seconds, once dismissed as scrap, had become the aircraft carrying the soul of the jungle. 3 days later, when Japanese forces launched a counterattack from the east, ground supply lines were still blocked, but the sky had already been opened. Coune's teams continued rotating, maintaining a pace of 120 sorties per day. On the mountaintops, white cloths still appeared between tree canopies as signs of life. According to the 11th Airborne Daily Log, February 1945, casualty rates dropped by 40% in units resupplied by air within that week. Night fell, and the sound of insects filled the silence. In the sky, the L-5 engine noise still echoed steadily, tail lights blinking softly through the rain. A soldier looked up and whispered, "The sky's the only road left." The phrase spread through the battalion, becoming the unofficial motto of the 11th Airborne, and from that day on, the skies over Luzon were no longer the line between life and death. They became the only road that still led to hope. 3 months after Captain Felix A. Coune's first flight, the Luzon jungle was no longer a dead zone on the logistics map. According to the U.S. Army Air Force's statistical summary, May 1945, in 90 days, the fleet of L-4 Grasshoppers and L-5 Sentinels had transported over 1,800 tons of cargo, evacuated 2,000 wounded, and sustained supply lines for 4 frontline divisions. These figures didn't appear in propaganda reports, but inside the technical files of the Far East Command, they were marked with a brief note. Air resupply Luzon sector. Success beyond prediction. While other Pacific battlefields still relied on sea routes or large transport aircraft, at Luzon, a small, unofficial fleet operated without pause. Each L-4 consumed less than 30 litres of fuel per hour, yet could carry 200 kilograms of cargo, dropped precisely within a plus or minus 30-metre radius. Multiplied by hundreds of sorties per day, the overall efficiency far surpassed any traditional transport method. According to the 11th Airborne Operations Log, April 1945, air-delivered supplies accounted for 65% of the total battlefield logistics volume, 3 times the original projection. What was astonishing was that no official Air Force command structure stood behind them. Coune's pilots weren't part of the Air Force. They were directly assigned under the Artillery Command and still wore the Ground Forces insignia. In modern combat history, this was the first time an independent air logistics branch operated entirely within an Army ground unit. A logistics officer wrote in a 20th of March 1945 memo, "We've just created an air force no one realized existed." After Luzon, that success spread quickly. In April, engineering teams from the 11th Airborne brought the upgraded L-4 designs to New Guinea and Burma, working with the 1st Air Commando Group to test supply drops for jungle bases. According to the Southeast Asia Theatre Report, 1945, the results showed 87% accuracy, with a crate loss rate below 5%. The air supply section model was replicated almost exactly, forming the foundation for the Okinawa campaign months later, where late, 5 seconds supplied field medics amid bombing runs. Through that process, a new doctrine gradually took shape. It was called Tactical Air Supply Doctrine, a doctrine for low-altitude aerial resupply in complex terrain. The core principle was not power or altitude, but flexible response within tight spaces and difficult environments. According to CMH Pub 70-31, in 1946, the War Department officially approved this doctrine and established the Army Ground Forces Light Aviation Unit, tasked with developing a complete system of light aircraft for reconnaissance, medical evacuation, and tactical transport. From this foundation, the concept of MEDEVAC aeromedical evacuation was born. The first medical rescue flights in Luzon became the model for campaigns in Korea, 1951, and later in Vietnam. From the low-powered Continental A-65 engine, engineers developed the H-13 Sioux, the U.S. Army's first medical evacuation helicopter. Many of the engineers involved in that program had served with Coune's team, bringing hands-on experience from the Luzon jungle into the design process. The impact even extended to the very concept of force organization. From one man's experiment, the military learned that a small flight team could have a strategic impact if properly structured. The command boundary between ground forces and air forces began to blur at the tactical level, paving the way for the emergence of air cavalry, the flying cavalry force synonymous with the 1,960 seconds. In a 1947 training manual, the opening line read, "Lesson from Luzon, small wings, big reach." According to the War Department Review, 1946, the Pacific Theater had over 3,300 light aircraft in operation, 90% of which served directly in communication, reconnaissance, and short-range transport missions. Those seemingly small numbers ended up shaping the entire framework of modern logistics. Strategic planners acknowledged that the L-4 and L-5 had created the Invisible Air Force, a flying force that existed outside the awareness of old doctrine, yet performed so effectively it could no longer be ignored. In post-war debriefings, Coune was often asked why he had dared to act without permission. He simply replied, "Because no one thought it was possible." That answer was later quoted in the U.S. Army Aviation Review, 1947, as a fitting explanation for an entire era of transformation. The skies over Luzon had proven that modern warfare wasn't decided only by bombs and artillery, but also by the ingenuity to exploit even the smallest tools. By the end of 1946, when final summaries were printed in Washington, the Luzon campaign was listed among the logistical turning points of World War II. No one mentioned the hum of small engines, the scent of thin fuel, or the trembling of wooden propellers. But inside each number was the shadow of low-flying missions, the subtle curves on logistics charts, where an unofficial force had redefined the world's understanding of air power. When the Luzon campaign ended, the sky grew quiet. No more propellers slicing through rain, no more scent of thin fuel drifting over the hills. The L-4 Grasshoppers and L-5 Sentinels that had kept thousands alive were hauled back to base, tarped over their dented frames. No photos were taken, no parades held, no headlines printed. In the 11th Airborne Division closing report, August 1945, the final line under logistics simply read, "Liaison aircraft, service completed." Short, cold. But behind it was a generation of pilots who had never flown high, those who learned to live at the fragile edge between war and humanity. They were ordinary men, young, their sweat mixed with rain and mud. No medals, no radar, no runway lights. On each flight, they carried a folded map in a breast pocket, a paper compass, and their eyes. According to the Army Air Force's pilot roster, 1,945, most pilots in the Grasshopper unit had never received heavy combat training. Many came from artillery observation teams or technical crews. One of them, Lieutenant Ray Morton, recalled, "We had nothing but instinct. If we saw a white patch in the canopy, it meant they were alive, so we flew down. When peace came, they removed their insignia, folded their uniforms, and left the camps. Some returned to farms in Illinois, some became mechanics, teachers, or civil engineers. They carried with them a quiet philosophy shaped in the jungles of Luzon. Low altitude saves lives. Fly low to sea. Fly slow, so no one gets left behind." According to the Veterans Oral History Project, 1962, many former pilots from the 11th Airborne later became advisors in the development of civilian aviation. One redesigned an air filter for crop dusters, based on the same principle Coune had once used to fight humidity in Luzon. To them, technology was not a symbol of power, but a tool for survival and to help. Captain Felix A. Coune returned to the US in late 1945. He never appeared in magazines, was never honored at engineering conferences. In 1947, he began teaching mechanics at a local university in Illinois. In his first lecture, he said, "The difference between an engineer and a soldier is time. One builds to live. One repairs just in time to stay alive." According to the Illinois Technical Review, 1948, his students called him the man who made air out of mud. Coune's legacy is not housed in a museum, but lives in a new doctrine of war. From his initiative, the concept of frontline air evacuation was born, moving the wounded by air directly from the front. Alongside it, the technique of low-altitude supply drops became standard training for airborne units in the Korean and Vietnam Wars. According to U.S. Army Aviation School records, 1951, the first training model reused the cargo hook system designed by Coune's team in Luzon. In Vietnam, 1968, MEDEVAC helicopter pilots were still trained with one opening line, "Remember Luzon, keep it low." An old L-5 pilot, now in his 80s, spoke during a 1982 taping of the Wings of the Forgotten program. The room was dark, with yellow light reflecting off the silver microphone. He set his glass of water on the table, looked straight into the camera. "I dropped crates into the jungle that were bigger than refrigerators. I heard them cheer when the crates hit the ground. I never saw their faces, but I knew they were alive." He paused for a moment, his hand trembling slightly. "Every time I took off, I thought about that no one needs to know my name, as long as they live one more day." Those stories drift across the decades like Luzon's rain, quiet but unrelenting. When history speaks of victory, it often recalls numbers and maps. But some triumphs exist only in the memories of those who flew low. According to CMH publication 70-31, by 1946, over 3,300 light aircraft operated on the front lines, most flown by artillery units, and the majority traced back to the original innovations in Luzon. Today, when MEDEVAC helicopters lift off in the night, red lights blinking across the sky, few remember it all began with a wooden propeller and the mud-covered hands of an officer in the Philippines. Technology may grow, may strengthen, but its roots are still in that will to save lives in the rain-drenched jungle of that year. On Coune's grave in Springfield, one line is etched on the stone. He built the road in the sky. That simple phrase is enough to remind us that sometimes the ones who never flew high were the ones who lifted the sky. When the war ended, the jungles of Luzon turned green again, and the patches of ground once used as airstrips were overgrown with grass. There were no more engine sounds, no dim lights in the rain at night. But if one stands still where the 11th Airborne once landed, they can still hear a distant echo the tremble of propellers that kept thousands alive. According to the U.S. Army Aviation Review 1947, the L-4 Grasshoppers were removed from service by the end of that year, most dismantled and sold to civilians for under $1,000 each. What once saved an entire battlefield disappeared from official records but not from memory. The sky Coune and his team left behind was not measured by altitude, but by courage. They proved that impossible was only a temporary limit, a word for those who had never tried flying low. When all maps were erased, when supply lines were cut, it was they, the small men, who dared to land among bombs and jungle mud. They didn't seek victory, they sought to preserve life. And from that resolve, a doctrine, an engineering discipline, a new humanitarian philosophy was born. Today, in every U.S. military aviation training center, a small photo still hangs in the hallway, an image of an L-4 with a handwritten caption, "Low altitude saves lives." There is no signature, no date, only a propeller blurred in the Sunday. That symbol has transcended war, becoming proof of precision, courage, survival, and the brilliance of humanity under the harshest conditions. According to CMH Pub 70-31, more than 3,300 light aircraft operated at the front lines in 1945, but what makes them remembered is not the number, but the spirit to fly when no one else would. From a technical standpoint, the L-4 Grasshopper was an unremarkable product. It was not fast, not powerful, not armored, but in spirit, it became a new definition of precision, a plane that could descend to 30 meters, drop cargo with an error margin of plus or minus 30 meters, and return through rain without leaving anyone behind. That made it a symbol of faith in the middle of war, the belief that technology only has meaning when it protects life. One of the last L-5 pilots recalled in a 1980 interview, "Every time I see a MEDEVAC helicopter fly overhead, I think, that's us, that's part of the sky we once held." He paused, eyes toward the distance, where the wind still moved like an old engine hum. "We didn't fly high, but we flew so others could." That sentence became an unofficial motto among MEDEVAC pilots for decades. From Luzon to New Guinea, from muddy roads to the deserts of Afghanistan later on, the spirit of the L-4 still lingers. It teaches that victory doesn't always come from altitude, but from the willingness to descend to save others. It teaches that technology can be born from compassion. And it teaches that in every war, what's worth keeping isn't the weapon, but the humanity that drove someone to create it. In a world growing ever faster and more distant, stories like these remind us to pause, to remember that sometimes the greatest thing comes from the smallest. A thin-winged fabric aircraft, a single length of parachute cord, a reckless idea, all were enough to rewrite the history of war. If you've ever seen something small save an entire world, you'll understand why stories like Luzon deserve to be told. They're not about bombs or bullets, they're about how humans chose to protect life amid death. And perhaps that is the sky we chose to keep, not the sky of victory, but the sky of courage, of intellect, of those who believed that lowering altitude was sometimes the only way to rise to humanity. If this story makes you believe in the power of persistence and creativity, leave a follow, a comment, or a thought. Every small click is a way to keep that memory alive, the memory of humble wings that turned the impossible into a lifeline across the skies of Luzon in 1945.